Very big thank you to Doug Peterson, CEO of S&P Global, and John Author, Senior Markets Editor at Bloomberg, for that important conversation. But don't go anywhere, because to parse out some of the themes you just heard, we'll now be joined by a panel of experts in a session titled The Rise of Green Finance. This is a universal theme that we at BAB have and will continue to cover with our programming. To lead us through this panel, it is my pleasure to introduce Carl Hess, Head of Investment, Risk, and Reinsurance at Willis Towers Watson, and partner to BAB for this conference. Carl, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Carl Hess at Willis Towers Watson. We're one of the world's leading advisory, broking, and solutions companies. Very pleased to be joining this distinguished panel on a most topical subject, the rise of green finance. This has been a particular focus for Willis Towers Watson, spearheaded by our Climate Resilience Hub, and we work with investors, corporates, and the public sector to respond to the challenges and opportunities going green means for the global economy. Our client base of organizations purchasing and providing insurance are now grappling with the current and future impact of green finance as the insurance market continues to harden, and we do ourselves grapple with this in our role as one of the world's largest fiduciary investment managers and advisors. Many of you in the audience will have seen the Prime Minister's optimistic piece of the Financial Times on planning the UK's green recovery this morning. So I guess we couldn't have really picked a more timely day for this discussion. I'm joined today by Rich Kassel of Capalino, Val Smith of Citi, and Euan Stirling of Aberdeen Standard. I think I can guarantee you a valuable range of perspectives on our chosen topic. Before I turn it over to my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, may I give you an overview of the House rules? So the discussion this morning will be about 45 minutes. The rest of the time is dedicated to Q&A with you. All participants are in listen-only mode as your mics are muted. We do encourage, and I will continue to encourage during this discussion, you to send in any questions. We will do our best to answer. I have no doubt that my colleagues here will indeed be able to answer them. Please submit those questions through the Q&A feature, which is located in the bottom of your screen. You'll see this feature as you hover over the Zoom menu. The session is being recorded, can be shared upon request. And with that, I'd like to ask the panel to do themselves, beginning with you, Rich.
Great. Good morning. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So my name is Rich Kassel. I run the Clean Energy and Sustainability Group at Capalino. Capalino is one of the US's leading urban strategy consulting and government affairs firms. We're based in New York, and I run a team that is mission driven around a very simple concept, which is that we now have the policies in place in New York City, in New York State, and in many other jurisdictions around the country to attract innovative companies and others who are bringing us the low carbon future. And our job is to help our clients navigate the business sector of New York, the government sector of New York City and state, and to partner with our colleagues in similar firms around the country to advance projects, policies, technologies, and frankly, good ideas that will help us decarbonize our buildings, our transportation, our energy sector, and our economy. Our clients range from startups who are doing interesting first ever technologies to Fortune 100 companies that have adopted long-term climate goals and now ask for our help in decarbonizing their operations, and global NGOs to local NGOs. We do a lot of work with the NGO sector to align what they're doing in terms of their meeting their carbon goals with what the business sector is doing as well. So it's great stuff. And it really flows from 21 years before Capalino, where I ran the fuel and vehicle work for the Natural Resources Defense Council in the US and around the world. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Val.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Val Smith. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for Citigroup, and have been at Citi for over 16 years now, and always in the sustainability function. So really have been with the firm through so many steps of this journey toward focusing more on green finance. And what my team does is essentially three things. We work with our partners across the businesses, across the regions, around the firm to develop our sustainability strategy. In July, we announced a 2025 Sustainable Progress Strategy, which includes a new $250 billion environmental finance goal. We also help to drive forward specific initiatives for the firm, ranging from our 100% renewable energy target for our global facilities to the introduction and development of fossil fuel policies, requirements, and including a phase out target for thermal coal mining, which was introduced in April. We also do a lot of engagement. So we spend a lot of time with clients where this is increasingly a C-suite issue for them, with our investors, with different stakeholder groups, our critics, our partners. And we use that engagement to really try to understand what's going on out there in the world, what the trends are, what the emerging expectations are of a bank in the green finance and the climate change space. And then we try to use what we learn and what we hear and bring that back into the bank to further influence our strategy. So really looking forward to this conversation and to diving into some of these details. Thank you.
Carl, you're on mute. You have to take yourself off mute.
Hello, we're back. Yeah, sorry, my microphone crashed, and so I've had to switch right in the middle of this. Euan is also having some technical difficulties joining, so I'll do my best to do this from the investor perspective. Oh, there you are, Euan.
I'm here.
Please,
sorry about
please, could you introduce yourself and we'll carry on.
Oh, sorry. Yes, my name's Euan Stirling. I'm the Global Head of Stewardship and ESG Investment at Aberdeen Standard Investment. And my role is really to fulfill our fiduciary duty to our clients by making sure that ESG factors are included in all of our investment decisions.
Thank you. And with that, let's dive right in. Climate events and climate change has the potential for sweeping negative impacts on businesses, economies, and societies around the world. Climate change will play a growing role in the way we conduct business today and in the future. This year has been a major year of disruption. I think we've been spending the last few minutes illustrating that. Brexit, pandemic, an unprecedented election season. How have these developments impacted the pivot to financing green? And maybe, Rich, I can ask you to dive in.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think COVID has shown us the importance of preparing for crises that we can foresee, even if we don't know the specifics of how they're going to hit us, where they're going to hit us, and when they're going to hit us. And climate is exactly that. It's a crisis that's already here. Even if we don't know exactly which coastal town in the Southeast or Caribbean island is going to get hit next summer, we know that there will be storms. We know that the climate crisis is having impacts now. So I think that forward-thinking policymakers and businesses and investors are seeing that, if anything, their commitments to investing in a low carbon future are even more important now than they were previously. And I think we're seeing that. I'll give you one specific example here in New York. In March, as we were climbing the first of the COVID walls, we faced a budget crisis. We had to adopt a state budget by April 1 by law at a time when we had no idea, frankly, how the revenue side was going to get hit. Needless to say, many programs were cut, many programs were put on hold, but Governor Cuomo and the legislature doubled down on their climate commitments. And so in the budget were a number of really important commitments and programs that will accelerate the siting of renewable energy in our upstate communities, that will accelerate the development of offshore wind off of the shores of Long Island, that will modernize our grid to get renewable energy from upstate down to the millions of users who need it down in the city. And I could go on, but the point here is that at a critical moment when we could have pulled our heads into the shell and said, this is not the time to be investing long and hard for the future, we went the other way. And I think the reason we did is a combination of two things. One, the understanding of the importance of preparing for the climate future, and also the recognition of the role that climate-related investments will make in our economic recovery. And the reason for that is here in New York, we've seen over the last 5 years, job growth in the clean energy sector growing at a roughly 9% a year pace. That's 2.5 times our state average. And that's a signal that if we want to grow our way out of the trough that we found ourselves in, clean energy and the green sector broadly defined is a key part of that. And I think all of that shows that, again, the genie's out of the bottle in terms of investing and committing to a low carbon future. And I think forward thinking businesses, investors, and policymakers are all recognizing this is not a time to pull back, it's a time to move forward.
Thank you. I mean, Val, certainly Citi is at the nexus of many of these discussions. Do you feel that indeed the scenario Richard described is sort of how we've managed through this year, or is it from your perspective a bit different?
Well, I really agree with the points that Richard made. And I think that what you've seen up to this year and still today is that you saw corporates and investors being pushed, obviously, by civil society, really rushing to fill a void where we didn't see adequate public policy in some jurisdictions to deal with climate change and to promote green finance. And so I think it's pretty incredible, first of all, to see the leadership that many corporates and investors as well have really, championed and taken on to help to drive climate solutions. I think what's remarkable about this year, it's been a difficult year, right? And so I hope when we have some distance and are able to look back, we realize that we were at such a sort of fork in the road in terms of the direction that we could take our approach to climate change and our approach to so many other really important issues. I know when COVID started, I felt like there was a lot of concern that, there was this narrative that, okay, now the S in environmental and social and governance in the ESG space, now the S is important. And that made a whole lot of sense, right? You saw the economic impacts of COVID, you saw the public health impacts of COVID and the human impacts of COVID. And there was this concern that humanity wouldn't be able to manage multiple crises at once. And it's really remarkable how at that turning point, it feels like, society overall made a distinct choice to try to tackle multiple crises. And I think it was really helped by the unfortunate narrative that you saw the impacts of COVID, being felt abundantly by populations that were lower income populations, often minority populations that had been, exposed to more environmental pollution, which further created, poor health outcomes from COVID. And then you saw the racial inequality protests that erupted in the United States and around the world, and, appropriately so. And I really appreciate how we were all able to sort of see the intersections of environmental and social issues and realize that as difficult as the economic disruption that we've felt from COVID has been, that there's pretty wide understanding that this is a dress rehearsal for the type of economic disruption we are feeling and could feel from climate change. So I think that, as we sort of approach the end of this year, the light in the tunnel is still pretty far away, but it feels like we've really hit this turning point in terms of being able to realize that these multiple crises have to be dealt with in a joined up way.
So you and the disruption is sort of first always felt in the price of financial assets. And
Yeah.
I'm sure you felt like a much younger man when the year started.
Always. Time does seem to accelerate, but this year in particular, Carol, I think that's very true. Yeah, and from an investment perspective, I think we've seen that light at the end of the tunnel that Val described actually accelerating towards us quite rapidly. And perhaps that's a peculiarly Scottish perspective, because as we sit here today, I was supposed to be attending COP26 in Glasgow, which is my neighbouring city. And I'm sure we'll get on to talking about COP later on, but that's how disruptive it's been. You know, I no longer have physical meetings, and the physical meetings I should have been at have had to be postponed. I think when you look at the investment impact, and I think about it in terms of the way that we make investment decisions, I think the COVID crisis has been quite instructive, actually. And I think that there's a number of things that we anticipated happening over the course of the next generation, which are now staring us in the face. And one of the obvious parallels between COVID and the climate crisis is that if you fail to take account of some of the long-term factors in your investment decision-making, you're going to get caught out in a very serious way. So some of these issues that are often regarded as non-financial turn out to be very financial, and it can be very financial in the short term, just to the point that you were making about disruption in financial markets. So some of the changes in demand patterns that we've seen, we could only dream about happening. You know, the fact that in the UK last month we sold more hybrid and electric vehicles than we did diesel vehicles. Now that we thought that would take a generation to happen. What does it mean for the demand pattern for office buildings? You know, there's so many things have changed so rapidly. It's almost like hitting the reset button. And if you weren't prepared to do that as an investor, then you will have been caught out quite seriously. So that's how I view the COVID crisis and draw comparisons and parallels with the climate crisis that's still upon us.
I remember as a child, I grew up outside of Chicago, and my favorite museum was the Museum of Science and Industry. And you know, this is, I regret to say, what, 50 years ago, right? And they had video phones on display, right? That you could actually make your little tiny screen, make a call to your fellow visitor to the museum, and wow, it's cool. And we did absolutely nothing about that, right, for the next 48 or so years. And meanwhile, here we are. So I think it's a brilliant illustration, really, of just how crisis can generate a bit of a sea change in how we're all doing this. You know, which I think points out that, you know, there is an urgency now, right, in advancing low carbon goals, even it's been squeezed out of the headlines over the past 6 months ago. We do have the Paris Climate Agreement. In fact, there's even a reasonable likelihood the US may be back in it in a few months' time, a few court cases notwithstanding. Corporate coalitions have formed with sign off by top business leaders, I think including people at this table, to move toward a low carbon economy. From your purview, I mean, what are the current challenges to adequately achieve a low carbon future? I mean, from quantification, metrics and standards, what are the gaps? What areas of collaboration do we need to focus on to achieve this? And maybe Val, could I ask you to lead off on that?
Sure, happy to try.
It's a team sport, don't worry.
It's a team sport, and I think, you know, the response is that it's a team sport. So first of all, I think that, you know, I spoke earlier about some of the incredible leadership that we've seen from the corporate sector with various, you know, agreements to align with the Paris Agreement from, you know, the early days of the We Are Still In Declaration here in the United States to commitments to reduce the carbon footprint of companies, whether it's your, you know, financing, Scope 3 finance emissions related to your clients' activities, or whether it's your own carbon footprint. And you're seeing a lot of voluntary action that is backed by data and metrics to begin to align with the Paris Agreement objectives. I think that when you look across the global economy and you see how much activity has already taken place how much progress we're making in terms of renewable energy, clean energy, how much progress we're making in terms of transportation, as Euan mentioned. There is still a lot of progress to be made. There are still sectors that we're just really beginning to learn how we could abate the greenhouse gas emissions. And I do think that, you know, the more we have globally connected public policy to address climate change, the better equipped we will be able to, you know, to tackle climate change, to allocate capital appropriately. I think what we're dealing with here is like we're quickly developing the solutions, we're making a ton of progress, but we know that to begin to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in the next 10 years, we have to really accelerate our efforts. And that's where I think, you know, as we look across the landscape, as we look across even our most carbon intensive clients, that's where we're seeing this demand to have clear public policy guardrails and to establish sort of a baseline of expected performance. And so that's really, I think, the key missing ingredient here. You know, obviously we're hopeful in terms of what can be accomplished in the United States. It will be somewhat limited, but nevertheless, I think, you know, we're starting to see some glimmers of what a Biden administration could begin to do to sort of right this ship from a public policy perspective. I think we're heartened to see, you know, the international collaboration that is happening in the public policy space as well. I think that actually, you know, as we look ahead to COP26, the kind of activity that the COPs tend to galvanize, and I think which we're really missing this year, is the establishment not just of new announcements, but of new partnerships and sort of the bringing together of different sectors and different actors to create ways to work differently together. And so my hope is that as we look forward into the next year, we start to see a level playing field in terms of public policy support for climate solutions, and you start to see the ability for us to form some of these more innovative partnerships to help to drive this forward and accelerate it.
So, I mean, Rick, you spend quite a bit of your time in sort of that intersection of public-private.
Sure. So when you first asked the question, I had one answer in mind, and as Val moved into thinking about partnerships coming out of COP, I realized I had an entirely different thought, but let me see if I can weave them together. The first is that I think that it is absolutely critical that we have a clear definition of what our goals are as we think about new policy structures. You know, here in the US, there is such a push towards electrification in many sectors, which is critical, but it's not the same as saying the goal is decarbonization, and we are going to adopt whatever technologies and processes and approaches will provide the fastest, most cost-effective, most replicable, scalable solutions. So I see the decarbonization, the clear definition of decarbonization as an important, maybe it sounds obvious, but I see that there are a lot of policymakers and advocates and others who are saying, electrify everything, that's it. That's the solution for a building, that's the solution for a vehicle. And it may be that in many of these sectors, it will be faster and cheaper to decarbonize the legacy assets, the fuels that are going into those assets and so on. And so I hope we can have a very full, robust, comprehensive approach that sees that there are so many different tools that are in the toolkit to get to the decarbonization goal. So that's number one. Number two is that I think a lot about the question of whether our policy architecture is flexible enough to integrate the innovation that we're seeing. So let me give you an example. New York has adopted a law that will require most of its large buildings to be retrofit to decarbonize over the coming decade. we are working with a startup that has an interesting idea, which is to downscale carbon capture to the building size level, so that a building that has a natural gas boiler, for example, would be able to capture its carbon and store it and sequester it for a beneficial use elsewhere, and in the process decarbonizing that building. The law is not actually flexible enough to say to a building owner or an investor, hey, if you use this system, you will get credit under that law. And so it is a hurdle that we're working on, and I am absolutely confident that we will work it out. But it is an example of a policy architecture. In this case, it's not 50 years old, it's a year old. And it's already showing that it's not quite flexible enough to have seen what's around the corner. Technologies that are going to come, and there will be plenty of others. But I think Val is really right about the partnership piece. In 2002, at the World Summit on Sustainable Development, many organizations and civil society, businesses, NGOs, and so on came together to develop what were called Type 2 partnerships that would bring together like-minded people, not to solve every problem, but to solve one problem they could all agree on. I was actually part of something called the Partnership for Clean Fuels and Vehicles, which brought together the oil sector, the vehicle sector, NGOs, and governments in US and Europe, basically with the idea of how do we adapt what we've done in the US, UK, and Europe to get lead out of gasoline, sulfur out of diesel vehicles, and introduce vehicle technology into the developing world. It was a huge success. There was only 2 countries in the world today that still use lead. There were over 100 when we started. And it was that kind of voluntary partnership where we said, there's a lot we don't agree on. NRDC and Exxon, believe me, don't agree on much, but we were at the same table saying, well, let's figure out how we're gonna get lead out of gasoline, how we're gonna desulfurize the fuels, and then go to the next level. And I think that I think Val is absolutely right. If we can come out of COP with some specific partnerships around solvable problems, have the right people involved in those partnerships to actually deploy the solutions, that's a win. That's a good win.
I mean, that win, presumably you would benefit investors, but
Absolutely.
do you think that they need to be taking a more active stance on addressing it?
Sorry, I missed that. Were you addressing that to me, Carl?
Yes, it was. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and what I would say was, sorry, the audio is a little bit tricky. But what I would say is, I'd like to take one of the concepts that Rich just introduced and think about it from an investor's perspective, and that was that in order to achieve this climate transition, if we think that all of our existing assets are redundant and we need to wait for that replacement cycle to kick in, then it will simply be too late. So if I look at our business, we could and we do set up funds that are absolutely focused on sustainability, and they have a very, very high hurdle for entry. So we will only invest in assets and companies where we think that they're deliberately targeting really positive environmental outcomes. So we can do that, but if I look at our assets under management, it's a very small percentage that is accounted for by that type of activity at the moment. What I think is much more productive and is probably essential to achieve a real and just transition to a low carbon economy is to turn the mainstream finance, the mainstream funds that we run, into climate conscious investments, and we are beginning to see that happen all across the globe now. But we're seeing it recent announcements in Europe from big corporates involved in carbon intensive industries announcing net zero targets. Now, what's not clear at the moment is exactly how they're going to achieve those targets. And that's something that we as investors and stewards of our clients' capital can pursue and interrogate in quite quite a forceful way in many cases, and we'd like to take some credit as an industry collectively for pushing companies in these directions. But what we can do is hold them to account, make sure that there is a proper transition from the current situation to the end state of net zero, and monitor their progress against that, and really hold them to account against the objectives that they've already set. So I think one of the obstacles is keeping green finance as a niche activity. I think what's much more productive and much more helpful to us and the real economy is to make mainstream finance much greener, and that's where our efforts are focused.
I mean, we've certainly seen, right, so some of the mainstreaming already started to occur. If you look at, say, the European insurance industry, right, where you know, if you're producing coal, right, you know, good luck getting insurance on what you're doing, right? It's sort of getting very much front and center of BAU rather than the fringe.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you know, is this? I'll pose this to anyone, right? Is all this occurring at sort of the scale and speed needed to get us to where we need to be at the time pace we need to be?
So I would say, having made a slow start, I'm seeing aggressive acceleration at the moment. But it's quite clear that from the commitments made at a government level in 2015 in Paris, we're well off track, and that's why we see it as absolutely essential to try and accelerate and engender some of the partnerships that were referred to earlier, I think by Val initially. It does require a collective effort. What we're seeing in particular in the UK is a combination of efforts between asset owners in the form of banks, insurance companies, pension schemes, asset managers in the form of investment firms like my own, but also the regulators and the policymakers aligning forces to make sure that everything is pointed in the right direction. So that's what gives me confidence that from quite a tricky and a slow start, that we can actually accelerate to catch up with the trend line that is required to meet the Paris objectives.
Now I see you nodding.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think Richard and I were both looking at each other, figuring out who to go next. Following signals on Zoom. I was just going to support what was just said, and I really like the visual image of sort of, you know, like we're creeping along, making progress, and then all of a sudden, are we at the beginning of that acceleration? And I guess it's just to say that the world is changing a lot faster than certainly I expected it to. I remember just probably 2 or 3 years ago now, sort of running into a colleague in the hall, back when we used to be able to do that. And it was a colleague who had also spent a number of years working in the sustainability space and was really a pioneer in this area. And we were just sort of talking about sort of the state of play in the sustainability and ESG space, and talking about how when investors really start to take this area seriously, whether they're doing so because it makes great investment sense or their clients are asking them to, when investors really start to take this seriously, you're going to see monumental change. And, you know, I swear it was like within a year of that conversation when all of a sudden you went from, you know, investors sort of signaling that it was one of the many important things that they were looking at, to it becoming sort of a top priority area that they were looking at, if not from an opportunity perspective, from a risk management perspective. And I think, you know, as a bank and also as a corporate who has to answer to our investors for our performance in this space, we are really feeling that difference. And I think the investor engagement is a huge part of why you are seeing this shift in our economy. And then, you know, all of us through our different positions are reinforcing that. You know, a bank is reinforcing that through its standards for who it finances, as well as through some of the work that we're doing to really analyze and develop metrics for climate risk. The insurance industry obviously is really supporting that. The consulting firms, who are providing all of us with advisory are also supporting that. And obviously civil society, just to give NGOs around the world a lot of credit for being the canaries in the coal mine and really, pushing us and pressuring Citi and, our clients more than a decade ago about the themes that we are now realizing are, top priority C-suite themes.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, it's easy to look at the moment we're in now and say, gee, is it just a moment? And I'm sure there are people who are wondering that and maybe even thinking that. But, the last 4 years, even while we had a total vacuum at the federal level in the US in terms of climate leadership, states were moving forward, cities were moving forward, businesses were moving forward, investors are moving forward. So at this moment, roughly 60% of the United States population lives in a state that has a net zero or other comparable 80 by 50, some form of 2030 and mid-century climate goal. Well, that provides certainty to businesses and investors who are thinking about, well, what is the future going to look like? And absolutely, we got started slow and we're a little behind the 8 ball. But at the same time, there's so much momentum already behind the transition that I think that will only accelerate. And listen, we're seeing it. President-elect Biden has a $2 trillion plan. Prime Minister Johnson, in the Financial Times, we read it this morning, 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. The genie's not going back in the bottle. The question that I ask myself often is, are we at that iPhone moment, or are we approaching that iPhone moment where something goes from, I wonder if it'll ever come, to how did we ever not have that? And I think we are approaching that. And we're approaching it not just because states and countries are making climate commitments, but because the cost of renewables is now cheaper than the cost of new fossil generation. And because we're now recognizing the importance of bringing the question of life cycle analyses and externalities into investment decisions. And because we're recognizing that to replace a megawatt of coal-fired electricity doesn't require a megawatt of renewable energy because of all the waste and losses and inefficiencies of that coal generation, and so many other factors. But it all boils down to, I think that, we started late. We started slower than we'd like for all of us who are in this sector. But boy, there's a lot of catch up going on. And I think we're going to see remarkable change in the years to come.
Just want to say, I love the analogy that Richard just made. I feel like for the last couple of years, we've been saying, like, are we at a tipping point? And what does it feel like when you're at the tipping point? And do you know when you're at a tipping point? And I think the analogy to the iPhone moment is completely, if you all remember what it felt like to hold your first iPhone and be like, wow, like, I don't have to go back to my house to check on my email. I don't have to go back to my house to get a map when I need to figure out where I'm going. And all of these little, for good and for bad, right? But like, the phones are so much a dominant part of our lives. And it feels hard to remember what life was like without them. And my kids who are teenagers won't ever know a life without them. They won't remember that. And so, can we look forward 10 years from now? So that was, the iPhone was 2007, if I remember, and then 2017, so can we look back, look ahead 10, 15 years from now and be like, remember that time when we talked about whether or not we would be able to, electrify everything and. So I think that was like a really interesting analogy, and let's hold on to this thought and come back 10 years from now and see where we are.
Oh. Carol, you've gone quiet again.
So you're making me ashamed of bringing up that video phone example at the museum. So just a reminder to the audience, Q&A, you can answer, you can do at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A button. A number of people put them through the chat as well. Don't worry, got that. We'll be taking your questions in just a few minutes. And so now is a good time to, if you have any to submit. We've got a number already, so thank you for that. Before we get to that, just a big one, right? I mean, who do you see as the winners and losers from the change we've been discussing? And maybe any advice to the audience as how to be one of the former and not the latter? Euan?
Oh dear. This is going to be a hostage to fortune question, isn't it? It's like being asked at the start of the year, where's the index going to end? Winners and losers. Well, I think there's quite clearly leaders in this sphere in lots of different industries. And you have representatives here from different parts of the financial service industry. And I think that we probably are quite self-selecting because, we have an ambition to be leaders in this area. So clearly my answer is going to focus around the winners, centering on leadership and actually putting your neck on the block every so often to say, unless we make this change, either in the way that we pursue investments or the way that we manage our investments, engage with companies that we invest in, promote climate sensitive policies for the physical assets that we invest in on behalf of our clients. I see that as a big part of leadership for the industry, and I want to be a part of it, and I know that my firm wants to be a part of it. It's quite important, though, that we're not alone, that we do bring other people with us. So it can't be an outright competition. It can't be Aberdeen Standard Investments winning at to the detriment of all of the other investment firms, because we make up a small portion of the financial services and investment market. So I think, going back to the points made earlier, there needs to be collaboration. There needs to be a concerted effort here. And an effort to convince the naysayers that the catalysts are there, that the transition to a low carbon economy is not just about monitoring and managing the negative aspects of it, but encouraging people into the positivity that should be around that transition, because there's an enormous amount of opportunity there. And we are absolutely determined that our clients should prosper and benefit from that. So that's how I would characterize it, Carol, without being held to a particular number or name as to who the winners and losers are. But thank you for that bear trap.
As long as you're not shorting Willis Towers Watson, I'll give you the lead. I mean, Rich, as a Manhattan resident, will New York be a winner?
New York's always a winner. There's 400 years of data there. Yes, New York will be a winner. Cities will be a winner. People around the world, of course, are moving to cities. They'll continue to move to cities. We like being around people. We like being, with our colleagues at lunch, and we like having the creativity of being together. We like going to the movies or concerts or whatever we like to do. New York will be a winner. I think also that, and London will be a winner. I look forward to continued friendly collaboration and competition over who's really going to be the green finance capital of the world. And I hope it's both of us. I think that investing is always about looking to the future and trying to figure out what it's going to look like and how do you deploy capital in a way that helps make your vision come true, right? At the end of the day, that's what it's about. And when I look into the future and I see the policy commitments that are made, the partnerships that are being created, the incredible public support and urgent desire for transitioning to a low carbon future, a more just transition to that future, I think anybody who bets against low carbon sustainable technologies is betting on horse and buggies. And My understanding of the financial history of 100 years ago is that the horse and buggy investors didn't do as well as the folks who invested in Ford. You know, I think that there are so many winners, but it's a trend, right? It's a trend towards low carbon. It's a trend towards sustainability. It's not the day-to-day ups and downs, but it's where do we think we're going to be 2030, 2040, 2050? And listen, if we're right, the world will be a more sustainable place, and people who invest that way will have made money. Those are two good things. If we're wrong, well, you know, we gave it our best shot, and it was the right thing to do, and we put our energy into that. So, but I think that the future is optimistic and bright for those who are willing to say the future will be different and more sustainable than the past.
Okay.
I can just, I guess, you know, conclude this point, and I really appreciate the comments my fellow panelists have made, and it makes me think of, like, there's always winners and losers, right? In the world and capitalism, there's always winners and losers, but I don't think in this instance it's necessarily going to be what you would expect. It's not like one industry is going to be the winner and one industry will be the loser. There will be winners and losers within each industry, just as there always is. But I think that we sometimes miss the point, and I think that both of my fellow panelists sort of underscored this, that like success in tackling climate change is not a zero-sum game. It's not like if I win, you have to lose. I think that if we are successful in you know, accomplishing all that we've talked about on this panel, that we will see more winners than losers. And I think it, you know, circles back to the importance of the partnerships that we started out this conversation with.
Speaking of partnerships, right? I mean, where do we see the balance between sort of government and regulator-driven change, and then change that's adopted by the market, presumably from, you know, sort of bottom up, or, you know, non-regulatory driven? Anyone got a guess on that?
Can I give a UK perspective on that? But I'm really keen to hear what's happening in the States as well. So I used to be a financials analyst in a former life, and I rarely admit that at dinner parties. It usually kills the conversation. But I kind of assumed that we would get absolutely nowhere on the climate transition unless we had a realistic carbon price. And we still don't have a realistic carbon price, but look at the progress that we're making. And it tells me that the focus is moving away from short-term financials. It's moving towards some of the longer-term things that we naturally focus on as environmental and social and governance analysts. And that to me is a good thing. I think it's also a reaction to the global financial crisis, where everybody's focus was intensely short-term, because that's the way people were rewarded. Since then, I like to think that part of this popularity is not just because of the looming climate crisis, but it's because of a different way of thinking about things. And the way that people are investing and the way that people are creating the regulatory framework around investing now is much more focused on these long-term factors, both social and environmental. And I think that's to the benefit of the whole financial community.
You know, I'm going to use a relentlessly American example here, and I apologize for it at the outset, but there was a book written by James Stewart a number of years ago that became a huge bestseller, in a movie called Moneyball. And Moneyball was about the notion that there are inefficiencies in every market, even markets we think we know everything about. The example that Moneyball's about happens to be baseball. Again, I apologize to my friends in the UK for using this example. But you know, Billy Beane and his team basically figured out that everything that we thought we knew about this sport was wrong, and that there were just huge inefficiencies that you could take advantage of and therefore win. And it was a great success, but it was a success because it's adaptable to so many different things. And in this conversation, what it's adaptable to is the notion that whether you care about the environment or not, whether you think that climate change is the most important issue or the least important issue, if you can identify and take advantage of market inefficiencies, the unbelievable waste in our energy sector, and move towards eliminating that waste in a way that is going to improve the bottom line for the businesses and ratepayers who are all affected by that, there's an opportunity there. And so I think that part of the reason why we're seeing so much progress is because it's not just the advocates who are saying it's the right thing to do. It's the financial analysts who are saying, hey, wait a minute. There's an opportunity here. And that doesn't change with politics. It doesn't change, that's just, people are going to find those opportunities. So that gives me some optimism. And I apologize in advance for what Billy Beane is going to do to UK soccer. Because I know that's where he spends his time and attention increasingly.
So sort of following on that, right? I mean, as we sort of look at what's voluntary versus mandatory, what's regional versus global, I mean, we've now got the TCFD disclosures being mandated in the UK, right? Do we see that as sort of the spearhead of what may be sunshine being required worldwide to force better, to your framework, Euan, to force better pricing into the market, whether it's the investment markets, financial markets, the insurance markets?
Yeah, well, I'm a firm believer in what we disclose, we manage. And so I think that it's a really positive move towards mandatory disclosures in these areas. Now, the TCFD framework still gives plenty of flexibility to companies, to investors, as to exactly how they tackle climate change and then report on it. So I think it's a really valuable framework. You cannot make these things mandatory unless there's a head of steam already behind them. So I'd go back to the point that I made earlier, that you do need people to lead on this. And the Financial Stability Board, who created the TCFD framework, I think we all owe them a huge debt of gratitude for being so imaginative and so bold and putting that out there. And I think it is worthy of widespread adoption. So yeah, I think that the fact that it's becoming mandatory is a positive step, but that couldn't have happened without the earlier steps. So I think that that's equally valuable and worthy. And we need to move further than that. So when people start to make their disclosures, it will become clear to all readers of financial statements and TCFD reports exactly what their approach is. And so going back to the earlier point I made about net zero commitments from companies, from regulators, from countries, it gives us a path to which we can hold individuals to account. And I think that's an equally positive step. And I look forward to being a part of generating that accountability.
Very good. I mean, Val, as given how many financial statements Citi's got to go through to run its business, that's got to make life better, I think.
Well, I think that both of my fellow panelists, Richard and Euan, have made some points that are directly relevant to this question. Richard talked about the need to have policy frameworks that allow for flexibility. I think that the idea that Euan raised around how mandatory has to follow from sort of the voluntary period where you are able to learn and innovate. We've certainly seen that with regard to the TCFD framework. We started reporting in alignment with TCFD in 2018. And, we got a lot of positive feedback for our first TCFD report in 2018. We were the first US bank to release this kind of report. And yet when I look back on it, like we barely understood what we were doing, right? We had done some really interesting pilot work and climate scenario analysis. We had, you know, what I think was a pretty strong governance structure and for managing climate change opportunities and risk. We had set a number of targets. You know, we were doing good metrics disclosure, but we were still very much at the beginning stages of that journey. As we're preparing our next TCFD report for hopefully release at the end of this year, it feels like we've learned so much and the community has learned so much. And, you know, if the requirement would put forward too early to require TCFD disclosure without flexibility, then I think we would have missed the mark in terms of what the intentions are. Now, I think, you know, different actors, the banks, our clients, are starting to understand what tools and methodologies work, which ones are driving us toward the conclusion, getting lots of helpful feedback from our investors in terms of what they want to see in this disclosure. And I'm a big believer in disclosure and data and metrics helping to really drive performance. I think that point's been made several times. And I think that as we look ahead at the mandatory disclosure requirements under TCFD in the UK and other jurisdictions, you know, it feels like, okay, we're probably ready for that. We've learned enough to do it well. And whether it's mandatory or voluntary, I think, you know, this pressure that we see from so many angles for good disclosure is going to really help to propel us.
Very good. I'm afraid we're running up on time. Anyone have any final thoughts they'd like to make sure they leave the audience with? And maybe I'll begin with you, Rich.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Carl. So I think it comes down to this. You know, the genie has left the bottle. It's not going back in. And we're living in an exciting time. We're living in an exciting time for shaping and defining what our climate future will look like, and all of us are playing our role in it. There are a couple of key features that are making this an exciting time. Number one, increasing policy certainty that is encouraging innovation and encouraging investment. Number two, increasing disclosures and other moves towards better understanding what are the climate risks so that people can make better investment decisions and innovation decisions. But none of this is one size fits all. What works in New York City is not going to be what works in Aberdeen. And what works in some parts of New York City won't work in other parts of New York City. And so we need performance-based objectives and standards that really have us moving towards quantifiable objectives. And then underneath that, we need to be open to new solutions and encourage the solutions that are going to come to us most quickly, most cost effectively, and as I said earlier, in ways that are replicable and scalable, not just in our parts of the world, but in the developing and emerging economies that are going to be moving as quickly as they can and as they should to improved standards of living, better health, better quality of life, and all of that requires energy. And so, you know, we've got some exciting times ahead, but I think we've got an emerging framework that all of us can work with so that we can each do our part to move the ball forward. And I'm super excited about it. And I'm really glad you invited me to be part of this conversation today. It's been great.
Thanks, Rich. Maybe you, and then we'll give Val the last word.
Okay, no, that's entirely appropriate. I think climate risk is frightening. You know, when I started dealing with it in earnest as an investment professional, it's almost so big that you think that what can one individual or one firm do to make a difference? I think the environment has shifted substantially, and I just like to reflect the same optimism that Rich just did. I think you know, green could be the new tech. If you're a serious investor or a serious banker, and you ignore this trend that we just described as picking up from a very slow pace, but now accelerating very, very rapidly, you could miss out on the investment opportunities of a lifetime. So that would be my parting thought, that the move to green and clean is massively exciting. Yes, you've got to watch your risks, but don't miss out on what could be an absolute tremendous opportunity.
So for the last word, you know, there are a few questions in the Q&A that ask whether or not we're now all of a sudden finding our, you know, brave voices with the prospect of a new administration in the United States that will be more climate friendly. And my answer to that is no, that if you look back over the past 4 years, there were so many headwinds, and yet companies were forced to find their own voices, right? They were forced to say, we are still in the Paris Agreement. They were forced to say, we support a price on carbon, because it wasn't, you know, a foregone conclusion, at least in the United States, that those statements were true. And so we had to step in and fill that void. But I think as we look forward, and, you know, it's so clear what our North Star is here. That, you know, whether or not you're scared for the economy's future or you're scared for your family's future, the North Star of solving climate change is very clear. And it's a question of whether we are going to have headwinds that prevent us from accelerating or tailwinds. And I think what we're now seeing from the corporate community, from the investor community, and increasingly from the policymakers and the regulator community is that we are going to have real tailwinds toward making this progress. And it's going to be difficult and it's going to be transformational. But, you know, all of a sudden the path is becoming pretty clear. And I think you're seeing new resolve, especially as we start to seriously plan for COP26 to get there.
Very good. Thank you all. Appreciate the spirited discussion. I think I'm turning back over to you now.